This is our presentation for the Neutering of Congress's Power, created by Alejandro, Esmeralda, EJ, and Meg.
History of early Congress. The original U.S. Congress, formed from the Articles of Confederation, was designed to solve issues between states and to nationally attempt to aid the interests of state governments, often doing little to aid the country as a whole. Through its ineffectiveness, the U.S. Congress was later rebuilt on the United States Constitution of 1789, establishing the Senate and House of Representatives, along with giving Congress more power and making it a sovereign legislature not controlled by state officials. Within this reformation, Congress became the sole lawmaking power in America, and the people were given more influence within Congress via the House of Representatives and by allowing the people to elect congressmen rather than state officials. How does Congress work? Congress contains the US Senate and the US House of Representatives. To give the people fair representation, each state has a fluctuating amount of senators based off of population, and to ensure equal power between states, every state has 2 senators. For a law to pass, it must go through both houses of Congress before proceeding to higher powers. This system is much more efficient and fair than the old one and is what we still use today. What is the neutering of Congress's power? The neutering of Congress describes the legislative authority being shifted by Congress from the legislative branch of government to the executive and judicial branches of government. Due to neutering over the past 100 years, most law and policymaking happens in federal agencies where the people have no firing power, thus taking away from the people and allowing Congress to avoid responsibility for controversial decisions, which helps them remain in incumbency. This causes the Supreme Court to become the battleground that Congress should be. This overall lack of control for the American people endangers the fairness and efficiency that lawmaking should have.
But why does the transfer of power stop Congress from functioning properly? As EJ mentioned, Congress's main function is to enact bills, thus create laws for citizens to follow. But by transferring their power, they are ultimately limiting their capabilities and authority, which ultimately gives them less power as the legislative branch. Congress transfers power to the president and agencies, so Congress isn't upholding its originally intended responsibilities. Thus, it becomes normal in this society. And evidence that supports this, I wanted to include one for Congress and the president and one for Congress and agencies. So in this example, in 2011, President Obama announced 45 executive actions. And the analogy I wanted to use here is basically like these executive actions act as like a fast pass. And so the president is basically skipping over this whole responsibility that Congress is supposed to take, and he's just going straight to policy making. And for Congress and agencies, one thing I wanted to point out was how once Congress gives these agencies the power to make their own policies, they aren't able to oversee what these agencies do, which ultimately could be detrimental to our society.
So what is the history of Congress transitioning this type of power? So this actually goes back to the 1930s and pretty much ramping up to around the 1960s. The implementation of the New Deal was in essence to, after the Great Depression, it allowed federal government to implement multiple social and economic issues that deal with a lot of those issues, walking from the Depression. Now, there's 3 main points that Sustain mentions in the journal article that we researched. The main one is that the New Deal implemented the rejection of the original constitutional commitment and the independent installated regulatory administration. So in essence, meaning that since the 1960s, pretty much the number of statutes implemented that by Congress limited and attempted to limit the administrative decisions through timetables and clear instructions about what exactly their job was. Courts became very aggressive around that time in reviewing administrative activity, and then they started to push things to the executive branch, as Esmeralda was mentioning. So this gave a little bit more power to the executive branch, which kind of in question makes you wonder, like, is there checks and balances, which goes into the third point of saying like the New Deal was a self-conscious revision of the original checks and balances. So checks and balances, that we know, is best known for regulating the power between branches of government to diminish the risk of tyranny. But you may ask, are you saying that we are pretty much losing that checks and balances with pushing powers to different branches. In essence, kind of, because Congress is neutering their power, pushing it over to other branches because they don't want to deal with those nitty gritty decisions when it comes to lawmaking, even though they are the biggest. They're the biggest in the articles of not articles, the Constitution in Article 1, but yeah, so pushing over is neutering their power. This led to the imbalance of power and increase of power of the executive branch, which, as we saw in class with SAS critique video in the Senate of to the Senate, was that members of Congress are trying to avoid those issues and trying to push it over to other people because they really want to save their own behinds, in essence, because they want to be there next year for the re-election. So what solutions can we propose for that?
Solutions to help Congress function. 2 ways to help Congress function is term limits and the Select Committee of the Modernization of Congress. Term limits allow for less wasteful government spending and can allow fresh faces to join and restructure Congress as a whole. Old faces in Congress who have served over many time periods might not know what's best for our current society, and term limits could help bring in new ideas and bills to make functioning easier. The Select Committee of the Modernization of Congress can help open up Congress so that the American people can easily see what is going on and help make changes to their democracy and legislation. This committee has already recommended 29 bills to Congress to help them become more reachable to the public and their needs, thus making Congress's functionality better.
Other class concepts that we can relate to that we've already learned throughout the semester is that of the single-minded seekers, which is, like we mentioned before, members of Congress are trying to avoid controversial and electorally risky bills just because they're trying to, not sway the swing too much and just, stay kind of in the middle, not trying to lean towards others because they want to get, their seat and maintain their seat. We also go into the prisoner's dilemma, which is why 2 people might not cooperate with each other, even though it's in their best interest. So members of Congress might know that what's the best interest, but just because they have that single-minded seeker, mindset, they're not going to go towards that because they just want to maintain their jobs. And then we also go into cartel theory, using the resources of states to maintain position with the political party system. But yeah, thanks for watching our Congress presentation of why neutering is one of the main issues of Congress's problems.